the pepper came overland. It always had. Down from the high passes of Persia, through the Levant, loaded onto galleys at Alexandria, then west, always west, across the Mediterranean to Venice. A journey of 4 months, sometimes 5, through heat and dust and Ottoman toll collectors who took their cut at every crossing. By the time a sack of pepper reached the Rialto, it had passed through 17 pairs of hands. Marco Dandolo was the 18th. He had done this for 40 years. His father had done it before him. The route was as old as the city itself, older maybe. It was not a business, it was a fact of nature. The sun rose in the east, water ran downhill, spice moved west to Venice. In the summer of 1499, a ship docked in Lisbon. It was carrying pepper that had never touched Alexandria, had never touched the Levant. It had come west, not across the Mediterranean, but around the entire continent of Africa. A route so long, so obviously dangerous, that no serious man had attempted it in living memory. The ship's captain was alive. The pepper was real. The price was lower than anything Marco had ever seen. He was 60 years old. He had perhaps 15 years left. And the world he had spent his life building inside had just been made optional. Understand what Venice was. Not the Venice of carnival masks and painted palaces. That Venice is a later invention, a city performing itself for tourists who would not arrive for another century. The Venice of 1499 was a machine for extracting wealth from geography. It sat at the hinge between east and west, and it taxed everything that passed through the hinge. Its nobility were merchants first and aristocrats second. Its churches were funded by trade routes. Its diplomats spoke Arabic and Ottoman Turkish alongside Latin. The city produced almost nothing. It moved things, and it was extraordinarily good at it. The Rialto, the commercial heart of the city, was not beautiful in the way foreigners imagined it. It was loud. It smelled of pepper and salt fish and the particular sharpness of money changing hands. Men shouted prices across the bridge before dawn. Contracts were written in dialects that mixed Venetian with Arabic numerals and the shorthand of men who had been doing the same deals for generations. Marco Dandolo moved through this world the way water moves through a channel, easily, without friction, because the channel had been cut exactly to his shape. He knew which Alexandrian factors to trust and which to avoid. He knew when to buy forward and when to wait. He knew that pepper from Calicut was sharper than pepper from Malabar, and that German buyers couldn't tell the difference, but French buyers could. He knew the names of the Ottoman officials who controlled the crossing points on the Levantine route, and which ones could be reasoned with, and which ones simply had to be paid. This knowledge had taken 40 years to build. It lived in him the way a language lives, not as a list of facts, but as instinct, as reflex. He had a warehouse near the Rialto Bridge, stone-floored, cool even in August, smelling of the sacks that had passed through it for 2 generations. He had a son named Pietro, 17 years old, who was learning the trade. A wife whose name does not appear in the records we have, which tells you something about whose lives were considered worth preserving. Marco was not trying to become great. He was trying to stay what he already was. He was trying to hand Pietro something solid, a warehouse, a set of relationships, a way of reading the market that would keep a family fed and respected for another generation. That was the entirety of his ambition. It was not a small ambition. Most men fail at it. The first sign wasn't a crash. It was a number. In 1501, pepper prices in Venice dropped. Not dramatically, not enough to panic. Merchants told each other it was seasonal, it would correct. It always corrected. But the Portuguese had started selling pepper in Antwerp, and they were selling it cheaper. Their route around Africa cut out every middleman between Lisbon and India. There were no Arab traders to pay, no Ottoman taxes at the crossing points, no Venetian docking fees, no 17 pairs of hands. The pepper arrived in Europe having passed through perhaps 4. Marco watched the price sheets and told himself it would stabilize. He had survived disruptions before. The Ottoman Wars in the 1470s had been a disruption. The plague of 1485 had been a disruption. Things always found their level. They didn't find their level. By 1503, a Venetian senator named Girolamo Priuli was writing in his diary, and I want you to hear this, because this is a man watching his world come apart in real time.
This is the worst news the Venetian Republic could ever have received. The spice trade has been the mother and wet nurse of Venice.
Girolamo Priuli, Diaries, 1503. Priuli was a senator. He had the overview. Marco didn't have the overview. Marco had the ledger. By 1504, Marco was selling at a loss on some contracts. The problem was not that he was doing anything wrong. He was buying at the same price he always had. The Alexandrian merchants hadn't dropped their rates because their costs hadn't changed. The overland route was as expensive as ever. It would always be as expensive. The bandits didn't become cheaper. The Ottoman toll collectors didn't become cheaper. Distance didn't become cheaper. Marco was caught between a supplier who couldn't change and a market that already had. He tried to renegotiate with his contacts in Alexandria. They were not interested. They had their own problems. And the problems were the same problem. He tried to find buyers in Germany who hadn't yet switched to the Portuguese supply. He found some. Not enough. He started drawing down the reserves. The money set aside for Pietro's inheritance, for the eventual expansion of the warehouse, for the contingencies that a careful man plans for. He told himself it was temporary. He told Pietro it was temporary. He may have believed it. In June of 1509, Venice lost the Battle of Agnadello. In a single afternoon, most of the Republic's mainland territory fell to the League of Cambrai. It was the worst military defeat in Venetian history. For Marco, it mattered for a simpler reason than the geopolitics. The Republic needed money. It taxed merchants. Marco paid. And when he totaled the accounts that winter, the drawn reserves, the thin margins, the emergency tax, he understood something he had been refusing to understand for almost a decade, quietly, without drama, in a room, alone, at night, with a candle burning down. The warehouse would have to go. He was 61 years old. He had spent his entire life learning a trade that the world had decided it no longer needed. But here is what I keep thinking about when I read accounts from this period. Marco was not alone. Hundreds of Venetian merchants were in exactly the same position, and the way they responded, what they did next, tells you something true about how people actually survive when history moves through them. Marco sold the warehouse in 1511. He used the money to settle his remaining debts and to set Pietro up with a smaller operation. Not spices, cloth, wool from the terra firma, linen from Flanders. A trade that didn't depend on routes he couldn't control, on crossings he couldn't afford, on a geography that had stopped favouring Venice. Pietro adapted. He was young enough to adapt. He had grown up watching the system fail, and so he had no nostalgia for it. He built something smaller and more cautious, and it lasted. Marco didn't adapt, not fully. He was too old and too formed by the thing that was gone. He spent his last years doing what older merchants did when the market moved past them. He became a broker, a go-between, a man who knew people and could connect buyers to sellers for a small commission on deals he no longer had the capital to make himself. A man who once had a warehouse now worked from a rented room near the Rialto. The same bridge he had crossed every morning for 40 years. The same smells, the same shouts, the same prices. Except the prices were no longer his. I want to be precise about something because it matters. Marco made almost every rational decision available to him. He watched the signs. He tried to renegotiate. He diversified his buyers. He paid his taxes. He drew down his savings rather than defaulting on his contract. He protected his son. He kept his word. None of it was enough. Not because he did anything wrong, but because the thing that had changed wasn't a problem he could solve. It wasn't a rival undercutting him, or a bad harvest, or a war disrupting a crossing. He was the shape of the world itself. Vasco da Gama had not sailed around Africa to ruin Marco Dandolo. He didn't know Marco Dandolo existed. He was trying to make Portugal rich. He succeeded, and Marco, along with several thousand men like him, was the cost. Da Gama's voyage didn't feel to the people living through it like a turning point in history. It felt like a bad few years for pepper prices, and then a worse few years, and then for people like Marco, like the ground had shifted under everything they'd built, slowly enough that you couldn't point to the moment it happened, only to the fact that it had. We tell the story of the Age of Discovery as a story of heroism, brave sailors, new continents, the expansion of the known world, and it was all of those things. But every expansion has a shadow, and the shadow falls on people who never chose to be in the story, who were simply living inside a system that worked until it didn't, for reasons that originated somewhere else entirely, in a decision made by a king they'd never heard of, about a sailor whose name they'd never learn until it was too late to matter. Venice didn't decline because it made mistakes. It declined because someone found a better route. Marco Dandolo didn't fail because he was a bad merchant. He failed because he was a very good merchant in a system that had just become unnecessary. History is full of Marcos. They are, in fact, the majority of history. The people who were good at the thing the world no longer needed, who adapted as much as they could, who protected the people they loved, and who were still, in the end, overtaken. We don't remember them. We remember the explorers. We remember the kings who funded the voyages and the navigators who found the routes. We remember the turning points. We don't remember the men standing at the other end of the turn. Pietro Dandolo, Marco's son, died in 1547, a modestly successful cloth merchant. His children knew nothing about the spice trade, nothing about the overland route, nothing about the names of the factors in Alexandria or the Ottoman toll collectors on the Levantine crossings. Within 2 generations, the entire body of knowledge that Marco had spent his life accumulating had simply ceased to exist, replaced by something smaller and safer and entirely disconnected from the world that had formed him. That is not a tragedy in the way we usually mean the word. Nobody was villainous. Nobody was punished for anything they had done. It is something quieter, and in some ways harder to sit with than a tragedy. It is just what happens. Most of history happens like that. Not in a palace, not on a battlefield, not in a moment anyone thought to write down. In a room, near a market, at night, where a man is looking at numbers that no longer add up, trying to understand, without anyone to explain it to him, why the world he was so good at navigating has quietly stopped being the world.